Imagine you're the best footballer in your country. Your country is the champion of your entire continent, and you've just been told, by the men who run world football, exactly what your continent is worth. It's January 1964. FIFA has published the qualifying slots for the 1966 World Cup in England. 16 teams will play at the tournament. Europe gets 10 places, South America gets 4, Central America and the Caribbean, 1, and then there's you, Africa, an entire continent, dozens of nations, hundreds of millions of people, and Asia, the largest continent on Earth, and Oceania too. All of it, added together, more than half of humanity, gets one place. One, shared. And to claim it, the champion of all Africa must travel across the world and win a playoff against the champion of all Asia for the privilege of a single seat at the table. More than half the planet, squeezed through a keyhole. Now look at 2026. 9 African teams at this World Cup, 8 or more from Asia. Morocco fresh off a World Cup semi-final and preparing to co-host in 2030. It seems natural now. Of course, the whole world plays at the World Cup. It was not natural. It was fought for. And the fight involved an entire continent doing something no continent has done before or since, going on strike against the World Cup itself. So how did Africa and Asia actually fight their way in? To understand the anger of 1964, you have to see how long the door had been locked. In the first 8 World Cups, nearly 40 years of tournaments, Africa managed exactly one appearance. Egypt, all the way back in 1934, won. The qualifying system was built to keep it that way. In the 1958 cycle, the rules effectively forced African and Asian teams to get past European opposition to qualify at all. For 1962, the winners of Africa and Asia each had to beat a European team in a playoff. Morocco, champions of Africa, were handed Spain. South Korea, champions of Asia, got Yugoslavia. Both lost, of course. The system wasn't a pathway, it was a wall with a door painted on it. And there was a deeper poison in the water. South Africa. The apartheid regime ran segregated football, and Africa's own confederation, CAF, had thrown South Africa out back in 1958. But FIFA, under its English president Sir Stanley Rouse, readmitted apartheid South Africa in 1963. Rouse's position was chilling in its indifference. If South Africa applied segregation in its football, he suggested, that was its own concern. The South African Federation even floated a proposal that sounds like satire, but was made in complete seriousness. They would send an all-white team to the 1966 World Cup and an all-black team to 1970. So, picture the view from Accra, from Cairo, from Addis Ababa in 1964. 17 African nations had just won their independence in a single year. A continent was standing up, and world football's answer was half a slot and a handshake for apartheid. The counterattack began in Ghana. Ghana were the kings of African football, back-to-back champions of the continent, and their president, Kwame Nkrumah, the great voice of Pan-Africanism, understood something ahead of his time. Football wasn't a distraction from the struggle for dignity. It was a stage for it. His sports chief, a formidable man named Ohene John, sat on FIFA's own executive committee, and when the 1966 allocations were published, John fired off a telegram to FIFA that deserves to be read aloud in its original all-capitals telegram style, registering strong objection to unfair World Cup arrangement for Afro-Asian countries. Stop. Afro-Asian countries struggling through painful, expensive qualifying series for one finalist representation is pathetic and unsound. Stop. At worst, Africa should have one finalist. Stop. Urgent. Reconsider. Ethiopia's Yidnekachu Tessema, one of the fathers of African football, put it even more sharply. The allocation, he said, was a mockery of economics, politics, and geography. FIFA's internal response tells you everything about the era. The General Secretary privately admitted the African arguments appeared, his word, reasonable, and then concluded that changing the decision would damage FIFA's prestige. The decision, he wrote, was final, reasonable, but final. So Africa did the unthinkable. In October 1964, all 15 African nations entered in qualifying withdrew. Every single one. An entire continent walked out of the World Cup. Not one African team would kick a single ball in qualification for England 1966. And FIFA's response to this historic act of protest? They fined CAF 5,000 Swiss francs, roughly the price of a decent car, for the inconvenience. So the 1966 World Cup went ahead. The tournament of Wembley, of Geoff Hurst's hat-trick, of English football's greatest day, with a hole in it where a continent should have been. And history filled that hole with two of the most delicious ironies in the sports story. The first, with Africa gone and South Korea withdrawn, the entire Afro-Asian pathway came down to one team, North Korea, who hammered Australia to claim the single shared slot. The unknowns, the afterthoughts. The team from the weak half of the world that supposedly didn't merit real places. And what did North Korea do at the tournament? They produced one of the greatest shocks in World Cup history, beating mighty Italy, two-time world champions, and sending them home in the group stage. Then, in the quarterfinal, they raced into a 3-0 lead against Portugal before finally being run down. The one team that squeezed through the keyhole nearly kicked the door off its hinges. So much for competitive standards. The second irony is even sharper. Ask who the best player of the 1966 World Cup was, and the answer is Eusebio, the tournament's top scorer with 9 goals, the man who single-handedly dragged Portugal back against North Korea. And where was Eusebio born? Mozambique, Africa. At the very World Cup that had locked the African continent out, the star of the show was an African, wearing the shirt of the European empire that colonized his homeland. Africa wasn't absent from the 1966 World Cup because it lacked footballers. Its footballers were there, winning the Golden Boot. What Africa lacked was a door. And here's the remarkable thing. The boycott worked. FIFA had held the line in public, but the empty space where a continent used to be was impossible to ignore, and CAF made clear they were prepared to do it again for 1970. So in 1968, FIFA's Congress voted, unanimously, to give Africa its own guaranteed place at the World Cup. Asia got its own place too. No more shared keyhole. No more playoff between continents for a single seat. At the 1970 World Cup in Mexico, Morocco walked out as Africa's first guaranteed representative, and Israel qualified through the Asian pathway. It had taken a continental strike, a fine, and a lost World Cup, but the wall had cracked, and once it cracked, it kept cracking. Africa's places grew to 2 in 1982, 3 in 1994, 5 in 1998. African teams stopped being curiosities and became contenders. Cameroon, lighting up 1990, Senegal beating the world champions in their opening match in 2002, Ghana within a handball of a semi-final in 2010, the year the World Cup itself was held on African soil for the first time. Asia rose alongside, South Korea reaching a semi-final as co-hosts in 2002, Japan becoming a fixture of the knockout rounds, and then came the moment that felt like the full stop on the whole argument. Morocco, 2022, the team of a continent and half the world's diaspora, knocking out Belgium, Spain, and Portugal to become the first African side ever to reach a World Cup semi-final. 60 years earlier, Morocco had been forced to beat Spain just to be allowed in, and lost. Now they beat Spain at the World Cup, on the way to the last 4. Which brings us back to 2026, and the part of this story hiding in plain sight. This World Cup has 48 teams, and people love to argue about that. Too big, too bloated, too many weak teams, but look at where those new places went. 9 for Africa, more than 8 for Asia. The 2026 format is, in a very real sense, the final settlement of the war that O'Hane John's telegram started, the long, slow undoing of a world where 10 of 16 places belong to Europe and half of humanity shared one. And there's a lesson buried in the 1966 story that goes beyond football. Every argument used to keep Africa and Asia out, not competitive enough, not ready, logistically inconvenient, collapsed the moment the door opened. North Korea beat Italy with the very first key. Eusebio won the Golden Boot, while his continent stood outside. Morocco reached a semi-final within living memory of being told their whole continent merited half a place. The talent was never missing, only the invitation was. So when the anthems play in 2026, and 9 African nations and a wall of Asian teams line up among the 48, remember that none of it was given. It was demanded by a newly independent continent that looked at the biggest tournament on Earth, saw a locked door, and decided it would rather stay home with its dignity than beg at the keyhole. 15 nations walked away from the World Cup so that, one day, their grandchildren could walk into it. That's how Africa and Asia got their place. They didn't find a seat at the table, they pulled up their own.